On September 29, 1767, a ship called the Lord Ligonier slid into Annapolis Harbor, carrying 98 terrified Africans in its belly. 42 others who had boarded in West Africa never lived to see land again. Among the survivors was a 17-year-old Mandinka warrior who should have been stepping into manhood, not chains. In Virginia's records, the boy who stepped off that ship is reduced to a few cold words: Negro male, approximately 17 Mandingo. A week later, another line appears in a planter's ledger in Spotsylvania County: slave purchased. Name Toby. Those books, written in careful colonial script, tell you everything the owners wanted remembered and nothing they wanted forgotten. They don't tell you the name his father whispered over him as a baby. They don't tell you what was taken from him long before he was renamed. And they certainly don't tell you that for the next 55 years, this Toby would fight a quiet war to keep one thing they could never quite tear out of him: his name. His real name was Kunta Kinte. What you're about to hear was buried under 2 centuries of silence, sanitized textbooks, and plantation myths. The truth isn't just worse than the stories you were fed. It's more methodical, more calculated, and far more disturbing. Before we descend into that nightmare, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the rest of this series. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Because this story doesn't begin in America. It begins on a river that cut West Africa open like a wound. By the mid-1700s, the Gambia River was less a natural waterway and more a highway of human misery. British slave ships pushed deeper inland there than almost anywhere else on that coast. On James Island, a stone fort sat like a rotten tooth in the river's mouth, a trading post where tens of thousands of Africans had already been processed, priced, and shipped away. By 1767, demand from Virginia's tobacco plantations was spiking. Fields were swallowing bodies faster than ships could replace them. Wars between African kingdoms and the greed of local slave dealers became gears in a much larger machine. The Royal African Company offered bonus payments for a very specific product: young, strong men with warrior training. Workers who could survive breaking labor long enough to turn a profit. 2 miles upriver from James Island lay the Mandinka village of Jafur. There, the Kinte clan had carved out a reputation over generations as blacksmiths and holy men. They mended iron, forged tools and weapons, performed prayers and rituals that stitched community and faith together. They knew the British fort stood too close for comfort. They knew the river carried more than fish and traders. It carried danger. The Mandinka had survived centuries by perfecting a double life: outwardly calm and cooperative, inwardly stubborn and secretive. They greeted Europeans with politeness, but kept their real ceremonies deep in the forest, away from white eyes. They warned their children, stay away from the river alone. Never wander into the forest without others. If you see slavers, African or European, run. No one in the village understood these threats better than Omoro Kinte, the blacksmith. At his forge, he'd handled the very iron that would later chain men by the neck. He'd seen the shackles, felt their weight, heard rumors of whole villages emptied in a single night. He knew that in a world like that, strength was no longer enough. You needed foresight. So he gave his eldest son 2 inheritances, a craft and a name. The craft was drum making, not just art but survival. On slave ships, drummers sometimes lived longer. Captains used them to force exercise on chained captives, to stamp fake cheer into the nightmare. Omoro hoped that if the worst happened, this skill might keep his boy alive. The name was Kunta. In Mandinka tradition, names are more than labels. They're declarations. Kont meant complete or whole. A name reserved for firstborn sons expected to carry a family's story forward. The Kinte line could be spoken back 7 generations. Each ancestor named, each life linked in a chain of memory more powerful than any chain of iron. By 17, Kunta Kinte was exactly what his father had hoped for. He'd finished his manhood rites. He could hunt with a spear. He understood his people's laws and prayers. He could list his lineage without hesitation, each name like a drumbeat from the past. Elders already spoke of him as someone destined to become a respected leader one day. That future died on an ordinary morning. It was early July 1767 when Kunta walked into the forest to gather wood. He was searching for a particular hardwood used for drums, a tree that grew about 3 miles from Jafure, far enough to be dangerous, close enough that young men went there often. He carried no weapon. The area was considered a sacred gathering ground, not a hunting range. Here, warriors left their spears at home. Kunta moved with the easy confidence of someone who had walked these paths since childhood. He knew the smell of the earth after rain, the bend of each tree, the way light filtered through the leaves at that hour. What he did not know was that 3 days earlier, a British colonial officer named O'Hare had arrived at James Island with orders Virginia planters needed a large shipment of slaves fast. The Lord Ligonier sat anchored offshore, a floating factory designed for one purpose, crushing human beings into commodities. Its captain, Thomas Davies, had room for roughly 140 captives. Every empty space meant lost profit. The usual networks of African slave raiders, known as slatees, had already been hired and armed. Bonuses promised for young male captives between 15 and 25, men like Kunta. 4 slatees had been tracking him since he stepped into the trees. They were not amateurs. These were professionals who had turned hunting humans into a craft. They knew exactly how much noise would carry, how quickly a shout could reach the village. The trick was speed, precision, and overwhelming force in the first seconds. Turn a person into an object before their mind could catch up. The attack came from behind. A club smashed into Kunta's shoulder with bone, deep force driving him to his knees. Before he could draw breath to scream, hands clamped over his mouth. Others pinned his arms and legs. In one fluid, practice sequence, a cloth was wrapped over his eyes and mouth, a gag and blindfold in one, rope bit into his wrists. In less than 90 seconds, Kunta Kinte went from a free Mandinka youth to merchandise in transit. They dragged him 3 miles to a makeshift stockade near the river. There, in a rough enclosure of stakes and rope, 24 other captives already sat in chains. Some came from neighboring Mandinka villages. Others had been marched for weeks from deeper inland. Languages clashed, but the expression on their faces was the same as stunned disbelief, as if their souls were still trying to understand what their bodies already knew. People had warned them with stories. But stories, Kunta realized now, did not prepare you for the feeling of rope on your skin, for the weight of iron on your ankles, for the knowledge that you were now worth a price. For 3 days, Kunta sat in that pen. The conditions were not careless, they were calculated. The captives got just enough food and water to keep them alive. There was no shelter from the sun. At night, they shivered in the open air. Guards patrolled with clubs, beating anyone who spoke too loudly or prayed too openly. This was training. The body was being taught what happened when it resisted. The mind was being taught that suffering was the consequence of defiance. When the buyers finally came, they didn't look like the raiders. They were British. Sailors from the Lord Ligonier walked among the captives like shoppers at a market. With them came a ship's surgeon, Dr. Thompson. His job was not to heal, it was to protect profit. He inspected each person as farmers inspect livestock, hands on muscles, fingers in mouths, checking teeth, peering into eyes. He rejected 7 captives as too weak, too sick, too damaged. They were left behind. Their fate would be another kind of horror. Kunta passed, 17. Strong, trained from boyhood to work with metal and wood. In Virginia, he would be perfect for the fields. Payment changed hands, rum, cloth, iron bars. To the British, that was the moment the transformation was complete. A Mandinka son of the Kinte clan had become line item cargo. In the ship's log, he was reduced to a description male, approximately 17. Mandinka, his name did not appear. He was rowed out to the Lord Ligonier in small boats, 10 captives at a time. The sailors moved quickly. They knew that the first sight of the ship often broke people. The staggering size, the looming hull, the realization that the shore was about to vanish. It pushed some into blind, suicidal flight. Shackles and speed kept that instinct caged. When Kunta raised his head and saw the ship, he finally understood the scale of the machine he'd been dragged into. This wasn't a raid. It was an industry. The decks had been rebuilt to hold human cargo. Narrow platforms, low ceilings, spaces measured not in comfort but in inches. Bodies would be crammed side by side, shoulder to shoulder, for weeks in the dark. He could see faces in the tiny ventilation openings, staring down at him from the slave deck, eyes emptied by terror, eyes that had already learned what was coming. He was herded below. The ceiling brushed his back when he tried to stand. The air was thick enough to taste. Each body was allotted a space barely wider than a man's shoulders and no higher than a crouch. Iron shackles bit into his ankles. A chain connected him to another captive, someone he'd never met, someone who might live or die beside him. The door closed. Darkness became their new country, and somewhere above them, recorded in ink that still exists today, a British captain noted his satisfaction with the quality of cargo he'd acquired. The voyage had begun. The door to the slave deck slammed shut behind Kunta Kinte, sealing 140 human beings inside a space designed for cattle. The air was so thick with heat and human breath that it felt alive, pressing against skin, crawling into lungs. The ceiling hovered barely 5 feet overhead, too low to stand, too cramped to stretch, too suffocating to forget. This was the Middle Passage, a journey across the Atlantic that would last 6 to 12 weeks. For the British crew, it was routine. For the people chained below, it was a descent into a kind of hell the world still struggles to describe. Kunta was shackled to a man named Fanta, a stranger, but now, by force, his closest companion. Their ankles were locked together with iron cuffs, right to left, binding their movements, binding their fates. Fanta had already been in captivity for 2 weeks. His eyes carried the hollow knowledge of someone who understood what lay ahead. Above them, the ship creaked. The ocean murmured through wooden planks. But beneath the deck, sound took on a different shape, the muffled sobbing of men who realized their lives had ended the moment they were captured, the scraping of chains against wood, the shallow breathing of people fighting not to panic in darkness. The British sailors didn't speak to them, except to shout commands. The surgeon came down only to examine bodies like merchandise, evaluating value, not suffering. Everything about the ship was part of a system designed not to kill them, but to keep them alive just long enough to be sold. Death meant lost profit. A world measured in inches, each person had a space roughly 16 inches wide, barely enough to lie flat, impossible to turn without disturbing the person beside you. Bodies pressed together, sweat mixing, breath mingling, skin sticking to skin. Above them, a second platform added even more bodies, doubling the number of captives packed into the same suffocating space. When one man moved, everyone felt it. When someone vomited, it spread. When someone defecated, there was nowhere to escape the smell. Water came twice a day, barely enough to wet lips. Food, if you could call it that, arrived once daily in shared buckets, beans, yams, the occasional scrap of fish. British sailors dropped the buckets into the darkness and let the captives fight for handfuls of nourishment. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Waste buckets overflowed constantly, soaking the floorboards, seeping into wounds, drawing insects. Every cough echoed through the deck. Every fever spread. Every death came faster than anyone expected. Disease bloomed in the dark like a living creature. Within the first week, dysentery swept through the hold. The sick trembled uncontrollably, dehydrated, delirious. Men who had survived raids, imprisonment, and beatings now died gasping, chained to people who could do nothing but feel the final shudder of the body beside them. Dr. Thompson, the ship's surgeon, recorded each death with cold efficiency. Inventory loss acceptable. Kunta watched bodies grow weak, watched eyes glaze, watched men become still. And then he watched something worse, watched those bodies remain chained to the living until sailors finally noticed the stench. He watched Fanta pray in Mandinka whispers, asking the ancestors to guide them through this nightmare. And he watched hope bleed out of men who had once been warriors, hunters, farmers, fathers. Patterns of power even in this cage of death, Kunta observed. He saw which sailors treated captives with calculated cruelty and which treated them with indifference. He learned that the crew grew careless during storms. He noted that the surgeon rarely entered the hold except for inspections. He noticed that exercise time on deck happened the same hour each day. These observations didn't save lives, not yet. But they were seeds of resistance, tiny cracks in an otherwise impenetrable machine. Above all, he watched the crew's routines with the eyes of a warrior, not because escape was possible, but because understanding the enemy was the first step to surviving him. Meanwhile, among the captives, information flowed in whispers. A man named Kadi, who spoke some English, explained what he'd overheard from sailors. The ship was bound for Annapolis. From there, the Africans would be auctioned to tobacco planters in Virginia, where life expectancy for slaves was a decade at best. Overwork, heatstroke, disease, punishment, take your pick. Kunta listened. He said little, but he understood one thing clearly: this ship was not the end of his suffering. It was the beginning. The fever that stole Fanta 3 weeks into the voyage, a new fever swept the deck, fast, merciless, devouring the weak and the strong alike. Bodies glistened with sweat. People shivered uncontrollably, choking on air that could no longer cool them. Fanta fell ill. At first it was just chills, then a burning heat, then delirium. He whispered to ancestors, then to people who weren't there, then to no one at all. Kunta held him upright during the worst of it, supported his head, tried to share sips of water from the ration bowl, but nothing helped. Fanta died 2 days later. Kunta remained chained to the corpse for almost a full day before sailors removed the body and tossed it into the sea. The action was quick, emotionless. A splash, a ripple, and Fanta vanished from the world. They did not replace him. They shortened Kunta's chain and fastened it directly to the wall. Now he had even less room to move, even less humanity to hold on to. What the crew saw was inventory management. What Kunta felt was isolation so deep it scraped the soul raw. A storm that became a curse by the 7th week. The Atlantic sky began to darken. Winds shifted. Pressure dropped. Experienced sailors exchanged looks that made even the bravest captive uneasy. A storm was coming. When it hit like a hammer. Thunder cracked the sky apart. Waves slammed the hull with a violence that threatened to split planks. The ship lurched in sickening arcs, up, then down, then sideways, throwing bodies like rag dolls. The platforms above groaned under the weight. Chains clinked and rattled. Captives cried out, some in terror, some in prayer, some in pure hopelessness. Then the water came. Storm waves crashed over the deck above, sending torrents through the ventilation grates. Icy, filthy seawater poured into the hold, mixing with waste blood vomit. 6 inches deep, then 8, then more, sloshing over bodies chained to the floor. For 4 days, no food, no water, no light, no air that didn't taste like death. Men screamed until their voices broke. Others rocked silently, eyes blank, minds shattered. Some fought the chains so violently that their skin tore and their bones bruised. 18 more captives died. When the storm finally ended, Dr. Thompson descended with a lantern and a ledger. He walked among the bodies, tapping some with his boot, checking others for signs of breath. The dead were dragged out. The living were hosed down like livestock. Captain Davies noted the new death toll in his log: 40, 2 dead out of 140. A 30% loss. Acceptable, he recorded. But what he didn't record, what no ledger ever captured, was the psychological devastation. In that storm, something inside Kunta broke, and something else hardened. A name in the darkness, in the suffocating dark of the hold. As the ship neared America, men began forgetting who they were. Shock, infection, dehydration, memory itself eroded. Some could no longer recall the names of their own mothers, but Kunta refused to let go. Every morning, during the brief exercise period on deck, he performed a silent ritual. I am Kunta Kinte, son of Omoro Kinte, grandson of Karaba Kinte of the Kinte clan of Jafur, Mandinka. Freeborn, he recited his ancestors one by one, linking himself to a lineage that stretched back centuries. He remembered the taste of food cooked by his mother Binta, the sound of drums in the evening air, the feel of the soil beneath his bare feet. This was his rebellion. The ship could take his freedom. The chains could take his movement. The sickness could take his strength. But as long as he remembered his name, he was still whole. Landfall in the 11th week. The spectre of land appeared, a faint line on the horizon. The British sailors grew excited, their pace quickening as they scrubbed the deck, repaired damage, and, most tellingly, began feeding the captives slightly better, not out of economics. A slave who looked too sick fetched a lower price. On September 29, 1767, the Lord Ligonier entered Annapolis Harbor. Kunta Kinte had survived the Middle Passage. 42 others had not. What waited for him now? Auction blocks, violence, a new name forced upon him, years of suffering, none of it yet revealed itself. But the moment he set eyes on America's shore, something in him understood. His real fight was only beginning. When the Lord Ligonier dropped anchor in Annapolis Harbor, the salty air of the New World swept across the deck like a mockery of freedom. The ship had crossed the Atlantic, but for the 98 surviving Africans, the journey into darkness was only shifting form, not ending. One by one, sailors ordered the captives onto the deck. Weak legs trembled after weeks in chains, eyes burned in the sunlight. Some stumbled, some collapsed, but every one of them was forced upright long enough for the wealthy men of Maryland to look them over like horses at a fair. Kunta was among them. He blinked against the harsh brightness, breathing his first lungful of clean air in nearly 3 months. For a moment, he felt almost weightless, until the chains reminded him that freedom was not what waited ashore. British officials boarded first, carrying papers, quills, scales, and ledgers. They counted heads, checked the ship's manifest, and assessed duties as if tallying crates of tobacco. Then came the buyers. Tobacco planters, merchants, overseers, men in fine coats and powdered wigs. Their eyes scanned the Africans with the cool detachment of people accustomed to purchasing human beings. They inspected teeth, squeezed muscles, checked for injuries, looked for signs of good breeding stock. Not one asked a name. Names didn't matter, only bodies did. A cargo of choice, healthy slaves. On October 1, 1767, just 2 days after arrival, an advertisement appeared in the Maryland Gazette. Just imported in the ship Lord Ligonier, a cargo of choice healthy slaves. For sale. Healthy. Cargo. These words would shape the next half-century of Kunta's life. Buyers gathered at the tavern near the docks, a place where liquor flowed freely and human misery flowed even more freely. Outside the tavern, the Africans were lined up in rows. Shackles clanked, bare feet shuffled, and the cold breeze washed over skin still marked by chains and sores. Kunta watched as men barked orders he didn't understand, watched as women cried in languages he did, watched as buyers circled like predators around a herd. One planter approached him directly, a stocky white man with flushed cheeks and an expression that blended boredom with calculation. John Waller. Waller was a landowner from Spotsylvania County, Virginia. His plantation had lost several workers to disease and exhaustion. He needed new labor, young, strong male. He studied Kunta with a merchant's eye. He noted the broad shoulders, the wary strength, the alert gaze. Not once did he consider the Mandinka boy was evaluating him back. And not once did he imagine that this boy would haunt his family for decades. The bidding began. Kunta understood none of it. He listened to rapid English words tossed like coins in the air. He watched hands gesture, heads nod, papers signed. Then suddenly it was over. A rope was tied around his neck. A new owner held the other end. Virginia bound. The journey from Annapolis to the Waller plantation lasted 3 days. A cold wind whistled through the wagon slats as the enslaved captives, Kunta and 2 others John Waller had purchased, were transported like livestock. Food was minimal, water less so. None of the men spoke English enough to understand Waller's shouted commands. Every misunderstanding resulted in a strike. By the time they reached Spotsylvania County, the landscape no longer resembled anything familiar. Forests stretched for miles, the soil was red. The air carried the heavy scent of tobacco, this land's gold, and the reason so many Africans had been taken. The plantation sat on several hundred acres. Tobacco fields rolled across the land. A curing barn towered nearby. The main house, painted white, stood at a distance from the slave quarters, a cluster of cramped huts that barely kept out wind or rain. Dozens of enslaved people worked the fields. Some stopped to watch the new arrivals, some looked away. Some stared with unreadable pity. They had all been where he now stood. Every one of them had crossed a line between person and property. The theft of a name. Waller flipped open his ledger that night, dipped a quill into ink, and wrote the words that officially marked the beginning of Kunta's life as a slave. Negro male purchased. Name Toby. Just like that, history. His real history was erased. At least, that was the plan. The following morning, the enslaved workers were gathered as Waller's overseer, Connolly, presented the new arrivals. He pointed at Kunta, tapping his own chest as he spoke the name slowly to be. Kunta frowned. He pointed to himself, touched his chest, and said calmly, firmly, Kunta Kinte. Connolly repeated louder, Kunta Kinte. Kunta answered. The overseer's face reddened. This was defiance. Not loud, not violent, but unmistakable. So he struck Kunta across the face. Again came the name Toby. Again came the answer like a slap in return. Kunta Kinte. The blow this time knocked Kunta to his knees. The enslaved people watching froze. They had seen this before. Many had lived it. A name was the first thing the slave system tried to kill. Most eventually let it die. But Kunta would not. Even beaten, he lifted his head and repeated, Kunta Kinte. Connolly stared at him, breathing hard. This was no ordinary captive. This one still believed he belonged to himself. That made him dangerous. And it made him a target, a lesson in power. For 3 days, the struggle continued. Every time someone called him Toby, Kunta corrected them. Every correction earned a beating, sometimes a slap, sometimes a blow from a stick, sometimes a kick to the ribs. The other enslaved workers whispered among themselves. Some admired him. Some feared he would bring harsher punishment on them all. All of them recognized a rare spirit, someone who hadn't yet learned slavery's brutal mathematics of survival. But Kunta was not Nava. He knew punishment was coming. He just didn't know how far white men would go to teach a lesson. On the 4th day, Waller and Connolly staged a demonstration. In front of the entire enslaved population, they tied Kunta to a post. Waller stood before him, arms folded. What is your name? Connolly demanded. Whip cracked, a stripe of fire cut across his back. What is your name? Kunta Kinte. Another lash, then another, and another. The sound echoed across the field. Some of the enslaved workers turned away. Others stared, unable to move. What is your name? Each question was a command. Submit. Break. But Kunta refused. His voice grew faint, strained, trembling, but never surrendered. Finally the world went dark. His body slumped. His name remained unbroken. He had not given them Toby, not even once. A new kind of battle. When he woke hours later, he was lying in the cramped slave quarters, surrounded by people who had silently watched him cling to the only thing he still owned, his identity. He could not stand without pain. His back felt carved open. Every breath burned, but the first thing he whispered was, Kunta. That was enough. He had survived Africa. He had survived the Middle Passage. He had survived the whip. Now he would learn to survive America. Not by surrendering, but by adapting, resisting, and remembering. His war was no longer on the battlefield. It was inside his mind, inside his name, inside the story no ledger could erase. When the wounds on Kunta Kinte's back finally closed enough for him to stand, the overseer wasted no time. He was forced into the tobacco fields, still raw, still aching, but expected to work from dawn until dusk like every enslaved laborer on the Waller plantation. The tobacco fields stretched endlessly, rows upon rows of green leaves, each plant demanding care, each acre demanding bodies. To Kunta, the fields felt like another kind of ocean, one he was expected to drown in slowly. He had been taught to respect land in Africa, to see soil as something sacred. But here, soil was a weapon. It bound him to the plantation as tightly as chains bound him to the ship. The moment he stepped into the rows, the work began. Connolly demonstrated tasks with sharp, impatient movements: weeding, removing worms, pinching buds, cutting stalks, hauling leaves. Kunta understood none of his English, but pain translated everything perfectly. Do it wrong, he was struck. Do it slow, he was struck. Look up too long, he was struck. To the whites, the whip was grammar. Violence was vocabulary. But Kunta watched the other enslaved people carefully. He learned by observing the rhythm of their hands, the flow of their movements, the timing of their labor. In Africa, he had learned to shape iron, to study temperature by color, to listen to the ring of metal. Here, he applied those skills to survival. Within 2 weeks, he moved more efficiently, not fast, not willingly, but efficiently enough to avoid daily beatings. The enslaved people noticed this, and quietly, cautiously, they began to help him. The ones who watched him survive in every slave community. There were eyes that saw everything. Some watched to protect, some watched to warn, some watched to report. Kunta learned quickly who was who. The first to approach him was an older man known as Fiddler. His Mandinka was broken, a fading remnant of a language he had once spoken fluently as a boy stolen from Africa decades earlier. But he used enough familiar words to bridge the gap. "You from home," Fiddler whispered one evening, glancing around to ensure no whites were near. Kunta nodded. He had not heard Mandinka since the day of his capture. Hearing even fragments now was like tasting water after starvation. Fiddler became his first ally. He taught Kunta basic English, just enough to understand commands, insults, and threats. He taught him when to bow his head, when to stay silent, when to pretend not to understand. Not because he wanted Kunta to surrender, but because he wanted him to survive long enough to resist the right way. Others helped too, in different ways. An enslaved woman named Scylla slipped him extra scraps of food. A young man named Virgil showed him the safer paths between the fields. A quiet elder named Kofu hid fresh herbs under his sleeping mat to help his wounds heal. They did this secretly, always secretly. Kunta learned something essential about enslavement: that first month survival was a group effort. Resistance was a private one. Learning the enemy's world by late summer, Kunta's English improved. Not enough to speak fluently, but enough to understand the overseer's shouting, enough to obey without hesitation, enough to avoid punishment. But understanding the language also meant understanding the system. He learned that the plantation was one small part of a larger machine, one that stretched across Virginia, across the colonies, across the ocean. Slaves were bought, sold, loaned, traded, bred. White people spoke of enslaved lives the way farmers spoke of livestock. He listened when the overseer talked about productivity, listened when the Wallers discussed profits, listened when visitors talked about other plantations, listened when enslaved people whispered about rebellion and death. He saw that slavery wasn't chaos. It was order, cold, structured, calculated order. And if something was structured, it could be understood. If it could be understood, it could be exploited. A fire that would not go out. There was one thing Kunta could not hide: the defiance still burning behind his eyes. Whites noticed. Enslaved people noticed. Even the children noticed. The enslaved murmured among themselves, "That African gonna get himself killed. He ain't like us. He ain't learned yet. He too proud." They weren't wrong. Kunta wasn't afraid to work. He wasn't even afraid of suffering. But he could not pretend to be owned. Not fully, not inwardly. Every time someone called him Toby, he ignored it or corrected it softly, quietly, under his breath. The name Kunta Kinte became a whispered secret, a reminder, a rebellion. And the more the whites tried to force Toby upon him, the more fiercely he protected the name inside himself. He would bow his head for now, but he would never kneel in spirit. New knowledge, new strategy. As the nights grew cooler and autumn approached, Kunta began noticing patterns: which guards slept lightly, which dogs were tied, and which were loose. When wagon wheels creaked leaving the plantation and returning, which enslaved people traveled between properties, which way the river flowed, where the tree line thickened into dense forest. He watched everything, not because he was adjusting, but because he was planning. Freedom was not a dream to him. It was his birthright. No matter how long it took, no matter how far he had to run, he would try, and he would rather die in the attempt than live as someone else's property. The first sparks of rebellion months passed. Winter approached. Kunta's body grew accustomed to the labor. His English grew sharper. His understanding of the plantation deepened. But one truth remained unchanged: he was not Toby. He had never been Toby. He would never become Toby. People saw that fire in him. Some admired it, some feared it. Some wished they could remember their own African names the way he did. And from those quiet flames of identity, something new began to form inside him, a plan to escape. He didn't know when, he didn't know how, he didn't know who he could trust. But he knew this. He had lived through the ships. He had lived through the beatings. He had lived through the renaming. And if he could survive hell, he could survive running toward freedom. Winter had settled over Virginia like a cruel weight. Frost clung to the tobacco fields, turning the soil hard beneath Kunta Kinte's feet. The air sliced into his lungs each morning when he stepped outside the slave quarters. He had never known cold like this. Africa had its storms, its heat, its trials, but not this bone-deep chill that made even breathing feel like hard work. Yet the cold brought something unexpected: opportunity. Connolly, the overseer, spent more evenings inside the warm main house. The dogs were kept tied on especially bitter nights, and the men who conducted nightly head counts often rushed their checks, eager to escape the wind. Winter, for all its cruelty, gave Kunta a chance. He made his decision in silence. No one could know, not even Fiddler, not yet. If the plan failed, he alone would bear the consequences. For months, Kunta had studied everything: the path the wagon took when leaving the plantation, how quickly the moon set on clear nights, where the woods thickened into deep, protective darkness, which streams flowed north, which south, how the landscape shifted at the edges of Waller property. Slavery had stripped him of freedom, language, and homeland, but it had not stripped him of a warrior's mind. Every day he worked, every night he walked quietly from one shadow to another, memorizing the land with the same intensity he once used to study his father's forge. He didn't know the geography of America. He didn't know which direction led to free land or friendly people. But he understood one universal truth: distance was the enemy of capture. Distance meant hope. If he could get far enough away before dawn, before the dogs, before the men with guns, maybe, just maybe, he could find a path home. The night of escape, the night he chose, was moonless, the sky a thick black curtain. The overseer had drunk heavily that evening. The dogs were restless but tied. The cold was bitter enough that even white men avoided stepping outside unless necessary. Kunta waited until the quarters fell silent. Then he moved. Quiet as a shadow, he slid out the back door, whose latch he had studied for weeks. A simple push, a shift in the wood, and it opened without a creak. He stepped out into darkness, every sense alert. He wore nothing warm enough for the winter, only thin slave rags and weak shoes, but he didn't care. Cold could kill slowly. Slavery killed every day. He headed toward the tree line, toward the river, toward freedom. The branches above him blocked what little light existed. His breath fogged before him. Each step felt like walking on needles as frost bit his ankles. But he pushed forward, following a small creek he had seen flow north. North meant change. North meant possibility. North meant away from Waller. He walked for hours, slipping on rocks, stumbling over roots, his heart pounding, ears straining for the sound of dogs, but all he heard was the wind. By dawn, he had traveled nearly 8 miles. His legs ached. His hands stung. His feet felt like stone. But he kept moving until exhaustion forced him to collapse inside a shallow ditch where overgrown brush offered cover. For a moment, as sleep pulled him down, he believed he might actually succeed. But freedom in Virginia never stayed quiet for long. The slave catchers back on the plantation. Connolly discovered Kunta's absence during morning roll call. Rage spread across his face. A runaway made him look weak. A runaway made him look incompetent. And worse, a runaway cost John Waller money. He immediately sent for Thomas Matthews, a professional slave catcher feared throughout Spotsylvania County. Matthews was a different kind of hunter. He carried a musket, 2 pistols, and a knife at all times. His dogs, trained hounds with noses like knives, specialized in tracking human scents. He began at the point of escape, the slave quarters. Let the dogs smell the sleeping mat. Let them sniff the doorway. Let them taste the trail of cold air that followed Kunta into the night. It took less than 30 seconds for the dogs to find the scent. The capture Kunta awoke to barking, not distant, close, too close. He scrambled to his feet, heart exploding inside his chest. He ran, not fast enough, not far enough, but he ran with everything left inside him. He didn't get far. Matthews's dogs burst through the brush, teeth bared. Kunta turned, ready to fight, ready to die free. But a blow struck him from behind. He fell hard. 3 men were on him instantly. A rope looped around his neck. His wrists were bound. He fought until someone smashed a fist into his jaw. The world blurred. Matthews didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't show pleasure or disgust. For him, this was business. Just business. He paraded Kunta down the main roads on the walk back, letting everyone see what happened to Africans who dared run. White families stepped out to watch. Other enslaved people looked on with dread. For Kunta, humiliation was worse than pain. But worse was coming. The public punishment. John Waller was waiting when Matthews dragged Kunta back to the plantation. No lecture, no warning, no mercy. He ordered the same post used during the naming beating. Kunta was tied there, wrists stretched, back exposed. Connolly took the whip. What followed was not punishment. It was theater, a performance meant to crush hope in the hearts of every enslaved person watching. The whip tore flesh. It opened old wounds. It drew blood that soaked into the dirt. Between strikes, Waller shouted, "While you ran." Kunta said nothing. Not yes, not no. Not surrender. Silence was his final act of dignity. To men like Waller, silence was resistance, and resistance required escalation. The isolation after the beating left him barely conscious. Waller had Kunta thrown into a shed without food or water for 3 days. Alone. Cold, bleeding, but still alive, still himself. Survival became a slow, painful crawl back toward consciousness. Voices blurred, pain pulsed, but through it all, something inside him refused to die. He had failed, but he had not surrendered. The aftermath, when he returned to the fields days later, the enslaved people looked at him differently. Not with pity, with respect. He had done what many dreamed of but never dared. He had run. He had resisted. He had survived punishment meant to break him. Fiddler approached him quietly. "You still got fire." He murmured in English thickened by Africa. "But fire, it burn you too." Kunta said nothing. But inside he vowed the first run was not the last. Spring 1768 brought a softer wind to the Waller plantation, but nothing softened inside Kunta Kinte. If anything, the beating, the starvation, the humiliation of being dragged back like an animal, these things only sharpened his resolve. The scars on his back had healed into raised ridges, but the deeper wound was invisible. It lived in the place where a Mandinka warrior's pride resided, and that pride refused to die. Kunta watched, waited, learned. He realized something important. His first escape failed because he acted on desperation, not strategy. He fled with no plan, no supplies, no grasp of the land. This time would be different. This time, he would think like the hunters who once taught him to stalk antelope under the African sun. He would move with their patience, their discipline, their silence. Freedom was still the only choice he could live with. A new kind of training. Kunta spent evenings pretending to rest while secretly studying the plantation layout in detail. He observed which white men carried guns and which didn't, which enslaved men traveled between plantations, what the dogs barked at and what they ignored, which paths the wagons used and how long they were gone, what noise patterns carried across the fields at night, where the tree line thickened into deep woods. He even learned to mimic the way enslaved people walked when they carried messages to neighboring farms. Head down, steady stride, neither nervous nor hurried. He collected scraps of food, cornmeal, dried bits of salt pork, hiding them in a hole beneath a loose board in the quarters. He began practicing English phrases for deception. "Master sent me," delivering a message, going to the mill. Kunta hated the words, but he would use them as weapons. Survival was not obedience, survival was strategy, and Kunta was learning the enemy's tools. The moment he chose in May 1768, the chance came. Connolly left the plantation to visit his sister in Fredericksburg. For 2 days, a younger, lazier overseer supervised the workers, a man who drank too much and forgot things easily. The nights were warm, the dogs slept more, the moonlight stayed low, everything aligned. Kunta didn't pray for guidance. He already knew what to do. The second escape, he slipped away just past midnight, moving with the kind of controlled silence only someone born into the forest could master. The night wrapped around him like an old friend. This time, he avoided the creek where his scent had been easy to track months earlier. Instead, he followed the wagon road north, then cut east through a dense patch of woods. Every few minutes, he doubled back, stepping through shallow water to mask his scent. He walked in zigzags. He climbed small ridges and descended on the opposite sides. He moved like a hunter evading hunters. By dawn, he had traveled far deeper into Virginia than on his first attempt. The land grew strange, new trees, new smells, new sounds. But he kept walking. His stolen food was enough for 2 days. After that, he would find berries, roots, whatever the land offered. He dreamed, just for a moment, of someone friendly, someone free, someone who would help him. But dreams were dangerous. Dreams made a man careless. That afternoon, rain began to fall, relentless. It blurred tracks. That part was good. But it also blurred judgment. That part was fatal. Kunta spotted a small barn near a clearing. Rain hammered his back. His legs trembled. His stomach ached. His clothes were soaked. He didn't want to go inside. But he did. He curled behind a stack of hay, listened to the storm pounding the roof. And against everything he had promised himself, he slept. The mistake would cost him his freedom. Again. The dogs found him. First Matthews, the slave catcher, began the hunt the moment Connolly realized Kunta was missing. The man moved with a cold precision born of experience. He knew the value of his prey. He knew the reward for delivering runaways alive. The hounds sniffed the ground. Even rain couldn't fully erase the scent of desperation. By the third morning, the dogs barked sharply, one long howl, then another. They had found him. Kunta woke to growls. Before he could stand, Matthews and 2 hunters burst through the barn door. He lunged for escape, but a dog clamped onto his calf. Another clamped onto his arm, a rope cinched around his throat. A fist smashed his jaw. Strong as he was, he never had a chance. The world blurred again, this time with rain and shame mixing together on his skin. Matthews didn't rage or boast. He just hauled Kunta outside, tied his wrists, and began the long, humiliating parade back to the Waller plantation. He walked Kunta through public roads, past white families who pointed and whispered, past enslaved people who lowered their heads in grief, past houses where children stared wide-eyed at the African who had tried, twice, to choose freedom. The humiliation was part of the punishment. Matthews understood psychology as well as brutality. The decision to maim John Waller was waiting. But this time, he wasn't angry. He was cold, he was calculating. Kunta wasn't simply disobedient, he was dangerous. He had proven he would keep trying. And a man who would keep trying could not be controlled. Waller spoke quietly with his brother, Dr. William Waller, a physician, not a healer of humans, a healer of property. A decision was made. The punishment would be irreversible. The second attempt meant Kunta Kinte would never run again. The amputation. Kunta was dragged to the tool shed. He was tied down. 4 men held him still. A saw and a chisel were placed on a table. No anesthetic, no prayer, no mercy. The blade bit into flesh. The sound was worse than the pain, a thick, grating scrape that vibrated through his bones. Blood poured. Kunta screamed until his voice broke. By the time it was over, half his right foot was gone. Not cut cleanly but crudely, just enough to prevent running. Enough to hobble him for life. Enough to turn him from a threat into a crippled laborer. The Wallers didn't see a man mutilated. They saw an investment protected. The aftermath, pain and legend. Kunta lay feverish for days. Bell brought water. Fiddler stayed by his side. Old Kafu whispered prayers over him in Wolof and Mandinka. He did not die. He did not surrender. And in the quarters, stories began to spread. The African who refused his slave name. The man who ran twice. The warrior who lost his foot but not his spirit. A symbol of resistance whispered among the enslaved. The whites had destroyed part of his body, but in doing so, they had made him immortal in memory. People born into slavery would tell their children about him. Those children would tell their children, and the legend of Kunta Kinte began long before anyone wrote it down. When the fever finally broke, the world returned to Kunta Kinte slowly, like dawn creeping across a field after a long night. Pain was the first thing he felt. A burning, throbbing agony where his right foot used to be. Then came the sounds around him, quiet whispers from the enslaved quarters, a soft hymn someone hummed under their breath, the crackle of a small fire. Then Kunta heard a voice he recognized. Belle. She sat beside him, spooning broth into his mouth, wiping sweat from his forehead with a cloth dipped in cool water. Belle had been born into slavery on the Waller plantation. Unlike Kunta, she didn't remember Africa, but she remembered stories her parents told her, stories of rivers and ancestors. She carried her own kind of strength. "You stay quiet now," she said softly. "Rest. You still here. Still fighting." Kunta could barely lift his head. His voice was a whisper. "Still, Kunta?" Belle nodded. "Always." Just one word. But in that single exchange, a bond began forming that no whip and no master could break. Healing the unhealable Kunta's recovery took months. The physical pain was relentless. Infection threatened him daily. Every movement pulled at the crude stitches left by Dr. Waller. He could no longer stand properly. No longer walk without support. No longer run. To the Wallers, the amputation had achieved its purpose. The African wouldn't escape again. But to the enslaved people watching, something very different had happened. They saw a man nearly destroyed and still refusing to surrender. Mothers told their children, "That one. He got Africa in his bones." Old men whispered, "He still speak his real name. Lord help us, he still remember." To them, Kunta wasn't just a man anymore. He was a symbol. Proof that even when white men chopped away at your body, they could not cut out your soul unless you let them. A new role on the plantation. Kunta would never be a field worker again. His missing foot made that impossible. Instead, William Waller purchased him from his brother John, deciding that Kunta could be useful as a house servant or a driver. This brought Kunta closer to the Waller household, closer to the conversations white people had when they believed no one was listening. He learned more English, not because he wanted to, but because observation remained his greatest weapon. He noticed how the Wallers discussed business, crops, illness, money. He noticed their casual cruelty, how they talked about enslaved lives as numbers. He noticed how they lied to one another and to themselves, convincing themselves they were benevolent masters. In Africa, Kunta had learned the patterns of animals in the forest. Here he learned the patterns of white people. He became the plantation's buggy driver, transporting Dr. Waller between neighboring farms, markets, and towns. With every mile he traveled, he saw more of Virginia's vast slave system. Slaves everywhere, fields everywhere, fear everywhere, freedom nowhere. But Kunta did not let despair take root. If he could not run with his legs, he would run with his mind. Belle, a companion in survival, Belle continued tending to him daily, long after he was healed enough to walk. She scolded him when he refused to rest, smuggled extra food when she could, laughed at his stubbornness, guided him gently through tasks he didn't yet understand. But she never treated him like someone broken. Belle had her own scars, her own losses, her own battles with the plantation's cruelty. She understood something Kunta was only beginning to learn. Slavery survived by isolating its victims. Connection was rebellion. Kunta admired her strength, the way she navigated the white world with a mask of obedience while keeping her real thoughts hidden deep inside. She admired his fire, the raw, unbroken pride that glowed even when his body was failing. Without planning to, they became each other's refuge. One night, while tending a small cut on his hand, Belle asked softly, "You think you still a warrior?" Kunta's jaw tightened. "Warrior don't fade." Belle touched the stump of his foot gently. "Like this?" Kunta hesitated, then said, "Warrior fight with what he have." Belle smiled, not with pity but respect. "That's right," she said. "That's right." Kunta, the weight of a new lifetime moved forward. Winter to spring, spring to summer, summer to another harvest season. Kunta learned to walk with a staff, learned to drive the buggy with precision, learned to hide his emotions behind a mask, the same way Belle and the others had. He didn't want to adapt, but he did, because adaptation was survival. Still late at night, even when the pain throbbed through his leg, his mind returned to the same image, the forest in Juffior. The sound of drums, his father's voice saying, "Kunta, you are whole." Even now, he whispered his lineage. Kunta Kinte, son of Omoro Kinte, of the Kinte clan. Even if no one else remembered, he would. The birth of a daughter by 1772, something had changed between Kunta and Bell. What began as support became companionship. What began as companionship deepened into something the plantation could not allow but could not prevent: love. Real love. Not the forced breeding whites imposed. Not survival pairing, something deeper. Belle became pregnant in late 1772. When the baby girl was born the next year, Kunta held her gently, struck. The child's eyes were wide, curious, unbroken. He named her Kizzy, meaning to stay put. Not to accept enslavement, but to remind her, stay rooted in who you are. Stay rooted in your name, stay rooted in your people. Never let them strip your identity. He whispered Mandinka words into her tiny ears, told her about the Gambia River, told her about Omoro and Binta, told her she came from warriors. Belle watched silently, knowing the danger, but also knowing that a child without roots becomes a tree that can be blown away in any wind. Kizzy became the center of Kunta's world. Her existence gave him something even the lash couldn't destroy: legacy. The calm before future storms. As Kizzy grew, Kunta taught her African words and stories in secret. Belle taught her how to survive in a world built to crush black lives. Together, they gave their daughter two gifts: her father's identity, her mother's wisdom. Kizzy absorbed both. But the Waller plantation, like all plantations, was a fragile piece balanced on the knife edge of brutality. Force held it together, fear maintained it, punishment enforced it. And the day would come, sooner than Kunta realized, when his daughter would face that world alone. Kizzy Kinte grew like sunlight through cracks, quiet, bright, unstoppable. By the time she was 7, she ran through the plantation with a confidence no enslaved child should have been able to hold. She shadowed her mother Belle in the kitchen, clung to her father Kunta's leg when he practiced walking with his staff, and asked questions about everything she saw. She had Belle's warmth, she had Kunta's fire, and she had something no one expected: a mind hungry to learn. White children were educated. Black children were punished for trying to be. But fate placed someone in Kizzy's path who would change her destiny forever. Missy Ann, a dangerous friendship. Ann Waller, known as Missy Ann, was the young niece of Dr. Waller. She visited the plantation often, a girl only a few years older than Kizzy. And unlike the adults around her, she did not see Kizzy as property. She saw her as a friend. Missy Ann shared sweets with her, showed her dolls, read books aloud while Kizzy listened wide-eyed. One day, Missy Ann said the words that would alter the course of Kizzy's life. "Do you want me to teach you how to read?" Kizzy hesitated. Her mother's warnings echoed in her head. Reading got slaves whipped. Writing got slaves sold. Knowledge was a crime if you were black. But curiosity burned too brightly inside her. "Yes," she whispered. And so, in secret under the shade of trees or inside the kitchen when Belle wasn't looking, Missy Ann took a stick and traced letters in the dirt. A, B, C. Kizzy traced them back. And for the first time in her life, she felt powerful. Words were keys. Letters were doors. Books were a world no one controlled but the reader. She learned fast, faster than Missy Ann expected. Soon she could read simple sentences, then whole short stories. She copied the shapes with chalk on wood scraps. She wrote her name over and over: Kizzy. She added the name her father whispered in Mandinka, Kizzy Kinte. She did not know that this gift, this beautiful, dangerous gift, would one day destroy the life she knew. Kizzy the young woman. Years passed. Kizzy grew into a strong, clear-minded young woman. She could ride a horse better than most boys. She helped Belle in the kitchen with pride. She spent evenings listening to her father's Mandinka stories, memorizing every word. But she also lived in two worlds. With Missy Ann, she practiced reading and writing. With the enslaved children, she played, laughed, survived. With her parents, she learned African identity and dignity. Every night before sleep, Kunta whispered to her, "Remember your name. Remember your people. You are Kizzy Kinte." And she remembered. Belle watched with love and fear. Belle knew the truth. A smart slave was a threat, a literate slave was a crime, and Kizzy was both. The boy named Noah by 1786, Kizzy was 16. Beautiful, sharp, brave, and secretly literate. During Sunday gatherings where enslaved people from neighboring plantations were permitted to meet at church, she met Noah. Noah was tall, charming, confident. He could make Kizzy laugh even on the hardest days. He did small things for her, carried water, shared extra cornbread, walked her back to the road. They fell in love the way enslaved people often did, quickly, quietly, desperately, because love was the only freedom they could claim. Noah dreamed of escape, real escape, heading north to Pennsylvania where freedom was possible. "I'm going to run," he whispered one afternoon behind the church shed. "And when I'm free, I'll come back for you." Kizzy's heart raced. "What if you're caught?" she asked. "I won't be," he said confidently. "Not with what you can do." "What can I do?" Noah leaned close. "You can write me a pass." Kizzy froze. A traveling pass, written permission from a white master, was the only thing that allowed an enslaved person to move between counties without suspicion. Forgery of such a pass was punishable by whipping, torture, even sale. "Kizzy," Noah whispered, taking her hands, "we can be free, both of us. But I need that paper." Her love for him battled with her fear. In the end, love won. The forbidden pass. Late one night, while Belle slept and rain tapped against the cabin roof, Kizzy lit a tiny candle stub. On a piece of paper stolen from Missy Ann's writing lessons, she forged the letters Master Tom Lee gives permission for this slave to travel. She wrote it in clean, careful handwriting, exactly the way Missy Ann taught her. When she handed the note to Noah 2 nights later, he kissed her hand. "I'll come back," he promised. Those were the last words she ever heard from him. The capture and betrayal. Noah was caught within 2 days. Slave catchers found the forged pass in his pocket. They beat him until he confessed who wrote it. And when they brought him back to his master, the truth traveled faster than fire through dry grass. Kizzy had committed the unthinkable. She had learned to read. She had learned to write. And she had used those skills to challenge the institution of slavery itself. For white men, this was rebellion. For Dr. Waller, it was unforgivable. The sale. Kizzy was taken from her parents with no warning. One moment she was in the quarters. The next she was dragged outside, wrists bound, screaming for her mother, screaming for her father. Belle ran until she fell. Kunta fought until men tackled him. Both were helpless. Dr. Waller didn't hesitate. Selling her was not punishment, it was business. Kizzy was thrown into a wagon. Kunta lunged forward, trying to reach her, but several white men held him down. He screamed his daughter's name until his voice broke. "Kizzy! Kizzy! Izzy!" She reached out to him as the wagon pulled away. "Papa!" "Papa!" Kizzy's cries faded down the road. Kunta collapsed to the ground, pounding the dirt with both fists, wailing with a grief slaves were never allowed to show publicly. Belle dropped beside him, hands trembling, body shaking with sobs. Their daughter, their only child, was gone, sold to Thomas Lee in North Carolina, hundreds of miles away, never to return. The plantation felt quieter after that, as if a light had been extinguished, as if a part of Kunta's soul had been torn away forever. But even in grief, he whispered, "Kizzy Kinte, my daughter, your name will live, your story will live." And he was right. This was not the end of Kizzy's story. It was the beginning of a generational legacy that would outlive every man who ever tried to silence it. Kizzy's wagon disappeared down the dusty road, and with it went the last piece of Kunta Kinte's heart. The plantation fell silent after her screaming faded. No birds, no wind, no voices. Only the echo of a father who had fought a lifetime to hold on to his name, and now had no power to hold on to his child. Belle held Kunta as he trembled, not with fear, but with a grief so deep it hollowed the soul. For years, Kunta had survived the Middle Passage, the lash, the amputation, the humiliation, because he believed his legacy would live through his daughter. Now even that had been stolen. But something remarkable happened in the days that followed. The enslaved people whispered Kizzy's name. They repeated the stories Kunta had told her. They sang the Mandinka word he whispered every night. "Kinte, Kinte. The very identity Kunta refused to surrender became the seed of a memory no master could silence. Even after Kizzy was gone, the plantation carried the rhythm of Africa in its shadows, his name, his resistance, his story. Kunta never escaped again. He never walked freely again, but he never stopped telling the truth of who he was. And Kizzy, though torn from him, carried that truth into her new life in North Carolina. She taught it to her son, and he taught it to his children, and the name survived through generations. Kunta Kinte, never forgotten. The man they tried to rename Toby, the man they tried to break, became a legend whose memory outlived every plantation, every overseer, every chain. This is how his story ends, not in freedom of the body, but in the survival of a name that refused to die, the end.